It was the 6th year since my divorce, and I bumped into my ex-husband while holding my 3-year-old daughter at the corner of a street. He stared at the girl in my arms in a daze. After a long pause, he frowned and, with a tone of accusation, said, "She's almost 6 years old. Why does she look so small and skinny?" What? He actually thought the child I was holding was his. Maybe he believed that my love for him was so deep that even after he cheated and divorced me, I would still have given birth to his child. Chapter 1. The day George laid it all out on the table, I had just found out I was pregnant, and the test results were still in my hand, not yet shown to him. George sat on the couch, his attitude cold and unyielding. He told me that 6 months ago, he had an affair. Now, the woman he was seeing was pregnant, and he wanted to keep the child, which meant he had to divorce me. I questioned whether I had misheard, but before I could even voice the doubt, George had already anticipated what I wanted to ask. Looking me straight in the eye, expressionless, he said, "You heard me correctly." It felt as though my heart had been pricked by countless needles, the pain spreading in waves until I could barely stand. I never imagined my marriage would hit a snag like this. George was very handsome, but he had a cold, indifferent personality and was slow to warm up to others. In school, he was famously brilliant in the sciences. Many girls liked him, but I was the only one persistent enough to pursue him for 2 years until he finally agreed to be with me. I genuinely loved him. After we got together, even though it was mostly me reaching out to him, he eventually got used to my presence. We tied the knot right after graduating from university. 3 years of dating, 2 years of marriage, just 5 years together, and he was already tired of me? I couldn't accept it. My hands trembled as I reached into my bag to pull out the test results, wanting to tell George that I was pregnant too, but halfway through pulling it out, I stopped. Tears began streaming down my face like broken pearls. What was the point of showing it to him now? I asked myself honestly, even if George agreed to return to the family after his affair, would I still want him? No, I wouldn't. I found him disgusting, utterly disgusting. Chapter 2. It seemed like George was afraid I'd cause a scene. After telling me he wanted a divorce, he grabbed his keys and left without looking back. He didn't return until the next morning. I had spent the whole night crying on the couch, thinking, trying to figure out why George had cheated. As a rising star in the business world, George had been managing his family's failing business, which had started to turn around thanks to his efforts over the past 2 years. Because of this, he was always busy, working during the day and attending social events at night. It had become his routine. How did he even find the time to cheat? When he came back, George stood silently at the doorway, his hands in his pockets, staring at me. He didn't feel a shred of my despair, even though my eyes were so swollen I could barely see. I stared back at him from the couch. I don't know how long passed before I heard him say, "Have you cried enough? Cried enough?" Thinking back to the past 5 years, whenever we argued, no matter whose fault it was, I was always the one to back down first. He never once tried to comfort me. My one-sided devotion had now become self-deception. I struggled to stand up from the couch, a sharp pain in my lower abdomen. I chose to ignore it, lifting my chin and asking George, why? Why did he cheat? After knowing each other for 7 years and being together for 5, I had imagined countless reasons why George might ask for a divorce. As long as it wasn't because of cheating, I would have forgiven him for anything. But he had cheated. George averted his eyes, a hint of impatience on his face. "There's no reason, Chloe. Our fate has run its course. Can't we part on good terms?" Fate has run its course. Part on good terms. At that moment, my heart completely shattered. Under George's gaze, I nodded. Fine. I forced a smile. Let's divorce. Chapter 3. Because I agreed, the divorce went smoothly. We didn't even notify our families. We got the divorce certificate as hastily as we had gotten the marriage certificate. As the one at fault, George gave me a large sum of compensation, even gifting me the house we shared. After 2 years of marriage, it took him only half a day to pack his belongings. I watched as he loaded his luggage into the car and drove off without once looking back. 5 years. I thought, even if you were raising a dog for that long, you would have developed some affection, wouldn't you? When George decided to be ruthless, He truly was. Because of this, I suddenly wanted to see the woman he had cheated with. How good could she be to make George commit the most disgraceful act of his life, infidelity? In the end, I resisted the urge to see her. Since we were divorced, staying out of each other's lives was the best way to respect what we once had. The day after the divorce, I received a WeChat message from George's sister, Mary. She asked me who the woman was that George had brought home with him. Her message was followed by 3 laughing emojis, mocking me. I stared at the message for a long time before letting it go. I replied, "That's your new sister-in-law." After sending that message, I deleted Mary's contact from my phone. Mary had never liked me, and sending that message was just another way to make me uncomfortable. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. I didn't have the courage to be a single mother. So on the 3rd day after the divorce, I went to the hospital and scheduled a painless abortion. The elderly gynecologist, her face stern, told me that I would need a family member to accompany me for the procedure. I didn't have any family in the city, but who doesn't have a few close friends? On the day of the surgery, I called one of my best friends to go with me. Just as I was about to enter the operating room, she grabbed my hand suddenly. Her face was filled with concern. "Chloe, will you regret this?" Of course, I would. I already knew the answer, but there were 2 possible answers, and both would lead to pain. Chapter 4. After being discharged from the hospital, I resigned from my job. I had come to this city because of George, and now I was leaving because of him. Looking back, I realized that I had spent most of my youth orbiting around George. No wonder he got tired of me. I took care of my health and rested at home for a month. Before leaving, I entrusted the house to a real estate agent to sell. 2 hours before my flight, George suddenly called me. We had cut ties cleanly for more than a month since the divorce, and there had been no reason for either of us to get in touch, much less for George to initiate contact. I hesitated for a moment but picked up the phone. "Hello?" George's calm voice came through the receiver. "Are you selling the house?" I froze, instinctively replying, "Can't I sell it?" There was a long silence on the other end. After a while, George said coldly, "Do as you please." Then, he hung up. Did George still think I would indulge his temper as I did before? Ridiculous. Expressionless. I stared at my phone for a while. Before leaving, I went to the nearest phone shop and canceled my number. From now on, I didn't want to have any contact with George. Chapter 5. I was born in a small town, where development was slow and life wasn't as fast-paced as in many cities. My grandmother, now in her 80s, held my hand tightly the moment she saw me. She looked at me over and over again, scolding me for not eating well and for being too thin. I slowed my steps and, bathed in the golden sunset, walked home with her, just like in my childhood. Seeing her white hair and her hunched back, the heartache crept up on me, slow and belated. During the years I spent chasing after George, how many times had my dear grandmother waited at the village entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of her granddaughter stepping off the bus? I was raised by my grandmother, and my relationship with my parents wasn't very close. I hadn't even notified them when I came back after the divorce. On the 12th day of my return, a neighbor brought over her mobile phone for my grandmother. Her expression was complicated as she looked at me, and I instantly understood. It was my parents calling. When my grandmother handed me the phone, the woman on the other end was furiously yelling. I hung up without saying a word. Less than a minute later, the phone rang again. I had barely said hello before the shouting on the other end became even louder than before. I hung up once more. After 4 or 5 calls, the woman finally calmed down. No longer shouting, she demanded I give her my new phone number, accusing me of not informing her about something as big as my divorce. Asking what I was thinking, I pursed my lips and said quietly, "I'm thinking that it only took you 2 months to remember me this time, which is shorter than the last time." The silence on the other end was deafening. When I was young, my family was poor. After I was born, my parents decided to leave and try their luck elsewhere, leaving me with my grandmother. A few years later, they made some money, but they also had another child. I now had a younger sister. They justified this by saying I wasn't close to them. Later, during a summer break, they tried to take me home to bond. My sister was 6 years old, and I was 11. At that age, I had no interest in fighting over toys with a little kid. But my sister, whom I had only met a few times, harbored hostility toward me. I had picked up her Barbie doll, which had been tossed on the couch, and placed it on the table. By the time my parents came home from work, the doll was missing an arm and a leg. My sister sat quietly, clutching the doll and sobbing softly. She knew that acting like this would only make others dote on her more. My parents looked at me with complicated expressions. I tried to explain, insisting it wasn't me. To this day, I still remember the helplessness I felt in that moment. My mother waved her hand dismissively, her tone perfunctory. All right, I know it wasn't you. But when she turned her head, she said to my father, thinking I couldn't hear, "How did your mom raise her to be like this?" My father said nothing, silently agreeing that I had been the one to break the doll. Later, they bought more beautiful Barbie dolls and locked them in a storage room, a room only the three of them had the key to. I'm slightly allergic to seafood, something my grandmother always remembered, so seafood never appeared on our family's dining table. Before I went to stay with my parents, my grandmother had reminded my mother not to let me eat any seafood. My mother nodded in agreement, but on the third day at their house, I ended up in the hospital because of a bowl of seafood porridge. As I struggled to breathe in the emergency room, I could hear my parents arguing just outside the door. I didn't know she was allergic to seafood, my mother said. My father's voice was filled with exasperation. Didn't Mom tell you? She said so many things. How could I remember it all? My mother's voice turned sharp. Besides, she's old enough now. Shouldn't she know what she can and can't eat? I think she just wanted to eat it. Her sister wanted some, and she didn't want to miss out. Now, they were so angry, probably because the George they used to look down on had become a rising star in the business world. I had let go of the golden son-in-law who could have brought them business advantages. Otherwise, why else would they suddenly think to call me? Chapter 6. Given the seriousness of the situation, my parents actually rushed back that very night. Trailing behind them was my younger sister, who was attending university. Our eyes met, and the schadenfreude in her gaze was barely hidden. After 2 years of not seeing them, my parents had aged noticeably. The wrinkles at the corners of their eyes were deep, even when they weren't smiling. The nasolabial folds on my mother's face had become much more pronounced, giving her a somewhat sharp and harsh appearance. Ignoring my grandmother's enthusiastic greeting, my mother cast a cold glance in my direction. She hadn't even sat down before she angrily scolded me. "Chloe, have you grown wings? How could you get a divorce without consulting us about something so major?" My grandmother was shocked by this news, glancing between my mother and me, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something but decided against it. Knowing my familial ties were shallow, I felt no emotional stir. I merely stroked the tabby cat in my lap without saying a word. My mother couldn't stand my indifferent attitude and raised her voice sharply. "Chloe, is this how you treat your own mother? No wonder your marriage failed. You." Just as her words were getting more and more unreasonable, my father reached out to tug at her sleeve. He clicked his tongue in disapproval, his expression showing dissatisfaction. "You've lost your mind. How can you say that to your own child?" Realizing she had overstepped, my mother couldn't bring herself to apologize, so she huffed and turned away. My father gave me an awkward look, as if expecting me to apologize to my mother. I was the one being scolded, and I was supposed to apologize? For what? Is it written somewhere that children are born owing something to their parents? My grandmother quietly brought over some tea, gently reminding them, "Whatever it is, you should talk it through properly with the child." My mother cast her an irritated glance. "What do you know? Chloe's boldness is all because of you spoiling her." She often used my grandmother as an emotional punching bag. For the sake of family harmony, my grandmother always silently endured. I set the tabby cat on the ground, watching it trot away, then turned to my father and asked, "How did you find out about the divorce?" My father gave a sheepish laugh. "George called your mother and me. He said he hadn't been able to reach you for some time and was worried." I pursed my lips, finding the situation absurdly funny. He was the one who cheated. He was the one who first brought up divorce. He was the one who talked about fate running its course and parting on good terms. I didn't cling to him, since we were divorced and had no children to bind us together. I had every intention of cutting all ties with him, so what was he trying to do now? Meanwhile, my mother was still going on and on about how great George was. Every time she praised George, she subtly implied that my bad temper was to blame, that I should have been grateful George put up with me at all. I held my cup of water, sipping it slowly, and by the time I finished it, she had rehashed most of my old missteps, finally concluding that there must be something wrong with my brain. Of course, if my brain were functioning properly, why would I agree to a divorce after enduring 5 years of hardship with George, just as he was starting to succeed? Chapter 7. No matter how much my mother insulted me, the divorce was final. There was no going back. The day I cried all night without a word of comfort from George, I had an epiphany. Life is long, and I wasn't going to waste it on someone who didn't love me. In the end, my mother concluded that with George's meteoric rise in the business world, I absolutely couldn't afford to let go of him so easily. They reasoned that even if I had to divorce him, I should at least demand 10% of his company shares. I pressed my aching temples and interrupted their discussion. Have you said enough? Both of my parents turned to look at me. I didn't bother with subtlety and said flatly, "If you've finished, you should leave while you can still get tickets to go back." My mother stared at me, eyes wide, before launching into another tirade. She called me an ungrateful wretch, a cold-hearted daughter. I cast her a glance, stood up, and walked out. Cold-heartedness runs in the family. My cold-heartedness? I inherited it from them, and it's not the fault of anyone else. I found a small inn in town and stayed there. As soon as I had settled in, George called. I stared at those familiar 11 digits. After hesitating for a moment, I decided not to answer. Undeterred, George called again and again. When he called for the 7th time, I finally answered. There was no sound on the other end, just George's steady breathing. I didn't say anything either. I simply watched the call timer tick, waiting for it to reach 2 minutes. Then I broke the silence. Fate has run its course. Parting on good terms, that's what you said. I don't have a habit of keeping in touch with ex-husbands. George, whatever it is, don't call me again. The silence continued. I wasn't planning to wait for George to respond. After hanging up, I immediately blocked his number. My best friend was right. Trash belongs in the trash. George hadn't been particularly good to me while we were married. Now that we were divorced, what was the point of pretending to be some lovesick romantic? Didn't he find it hypocritical? Chapter 8. I knew my parents well. After struggling through tough times, they were especially fearful of returning to them. This was why we were never close. This time, I knew they wouldn't stay for more than a week. The only way to avoid seeing them was to stay away. I turned off my phone and stayed at the inn for 7 days. On the 7th evening, my grandmother, leaning on her old cane, hobbled her way to find me. This elderly woman, well into her 80s, had taken slow, careful steps all the way from the village to the town. I could picture her asking for directions as she made her way here. The setting sun cast an orange glow on her white hair, and her toothless smile lit up her face as she said, "Chloe, they've left. Let's go home. Grandma's here to take you back." It reminded me of my school days when I would finish night classes late, and no matter how late, she'd always wait for me at the village entrance. I thought I had outgrown crying, that I was past the age of tears. But in that moment, I couldn't stop the flood of emotion. After returning home with my grandmother, I finally turned my phone back on. As expected, my parents had bombarded me with long messages on WeChat, all full of accusations about my lack of filial piety. I didn't even bother opening them. George, too, had sent a message from a new number. He claimed he only wanted to make sure I was safe. That, after all, we had once been husband and wife. He promised not to contact me again and wished me well. He added that he would continue sending me a monthly allowance. I didn't pay it any mind. With a 7-figure bank balance, I had all the confidence I needed. I wanted to see the vast landscapes, the mountains, rivers, and lakes. I wanted to witness the sunrises and sunsets. Chapter 9. In the 2nd year of traveling with my grandmother, I ran into an schoolmate David from high school while I was away from home. I vaguely remembered him as someone who was top of the class, though he was quiet and reserved. We didn't have much contact back then, but I knew he existed. Later, we ended up attending the same university, and we occasionally crossed paths. Though we were little more than acquaintances, he was carrying a camera and a simple backpack. Also traveling, meeting an old friend far from home, and with our next destinations aligned, we decided to travel together. He didn't talk much, but he was respectful and thoughtful, especially toward my grandmother, who adored him. One night, lying in bed with my grandmother, looking at the stars through the skylight, she suddenly said, "David is a good boy." I understood what she meant and forced a dry chuckle. Yes, he is. When it comes to matters of the heart, elderly people tend to be especially perceptive. But between me and David, though we shared the same interests, there was an unbridgeable gap. I admired him, but that didn't mean I had feelings for him. I guess he probably felt the same way. Chapter 10. Grandma, being elderly, needed to rest for a couple of days whenever we arrived at a new place to regain her energy. Because of this, I was worried about delaying the schoolmates' David travel plans and often suggested he should go ahead without us. He didn't reject my suggestion but simply replied, "We can part ways at the next stop. I'd like to stay here for a few more days too." The misty rain over Jiangnan, the ancient town scenery, was as beautiful as a painting. Surrounded by such beauty, my mood lightened, and I couldn't help but glance at the David a few times. Unlike George's strikingly handsome but flamboyant appearance, the David's sharp features carried a softness that gave him a scholarly air, making him seem approachable at first sight. Noticing my gaze, he smiled politely, the rolling mountains in the distance reflected in his dark eyes, giving him an aura of serenity. The winding paths of the ancient town, the gentle rain creating a light mist, made the scene feel like a fairyland. I told Grandma I wanted to go for a walk. Grandma, feeling her age, didn't want to walk much. She sat under the eaves with some elderly women of a similar age from the town. They chatted in a mix of dialect and heavily accented Mandarin, laughing heartily, though it was unclear whether they understood each other's words. I stood watching for a while when the sound of approaching footsteps reached my ears. I turned my head, and through the misty rain, I saw the David walking toward me, holding a paper umbrella with a jade handle. He stopped beside me, standing tall and graceful, a figure of quiet elegance unlike any I had seen before. The David asked if I'd like to go for a walk together. That was exactly what I wanted. We wandered through the old town under the oil paper umbrella, passing by the green bricks and tiled roofs. He didn't speak much, and most of the conversation was initiated by me. He listened intently and responded seriously, as if he were trying to find the perfect answer to every question. I found it amusing, but, to be honest, I was no longer at an age where I could easily be moved. Chapter 11. At our next destination, the David and I parted ways. Afterward, Grandma and I crossed 3 mountains, 2 lakes, and never saw him again. We left home at the beginning of winter and didn't return until the end of summer. Grandma had a newfound spring in her step, always going out with her cane to chat with the neighbors, telling them all about the vast landscapes she had seen during our travels. Several elderly people in the village were her age. Even though her descriptions were often lacking, their eyes shone with envy and longing. There were also those who couldn't stand to see Grandma happy. Over tea or dinner, they'd pointedly ask me about my marriage. Grandma's smile froze, and after a long pause, she sighed. "Young folks' affairs are beyond us," she said, waving her hand. The old woman who had brought up the topic gave her a meaningful look. And that was the end of that conversation. Chapter 12. After resting at home for a few days, I began making new plans for my life. I had studied civil engineering in college, though I wasn't very good at my own courses, but I had attended quite a few agricultural classes. In a small town like this, land was abundant. I decided to lease a few acres to grow flowers and sell them. During this time, Mary contacted me several times through WeChat, always probing to see if I had truly moved on from her brother. I had loved George deeply, but in their eyes, my seemingly carefree departure was merely a strategic retreat. I had wasted too much time on George, poured too much effort into that relationship, and the cost of leaving was the loss of years of my youth. The price had been high. Around this time, I was busy setting up plastic greenhouses on the land I had leased. I didn't have the time or the inclination to respond to her. And eventually, the matter was left unresolved. I wasn't that clueless. At the very least, I knew when to cut my losses. Just as the greenhouses were about to be completed, an unexpected visitor arrived at my home. He was sitting in the courtyard, chatting with my grandmother, his posture straight, the setting sun casting a soft glow on his profile, making him look gentle and handsome. Sensing my presence, the David turned his head and smiled at me. I was passing by and thought I'd stop by to see you. For the first time in a long while, my heart skipped a beat before settling back into its usual rhythm. Chapter 13. After saying he had come to visit, the David didn't mention leaving again once he had settled in. Every morning, he would go out with me, carrying his camera, following behind me and taking pictures along the way. Sometimes, I would walk far ahead, only to find he had stopped somewhere. I'd wait for him. When we arrived at our destination, he would show me the photos he had taken: misty mornings, rising smoke, crisscrossing fields, scattered houses nestled among green mountains and blue waters. The scenery in the small town had its own charm. When I snapped back to reality, I realized just how close we had become. We exchanged glances and then quickly looked away. Flustered, I saw a faint blush spread across the tips of the David's ears. It was only then that I became aware of something unusual. So, on the day the flowers in my field began to break through the soil, I invited the David to share a drink in the wooden house by the flower fields. As the alcohol took hold, I poured out everything that had happened between George and me over the years. The David was momentarily stunned, but he was smart and quickly understood my unspoken meaning. After a brief pause, he let out a sigh. In the soft yellow light, his gaze was intense as he looked at me. You don't need to say anything, I already know. But he wouldn't say how he knew. Now that my passionate love for George had faded, I wasn't sure if I still had the capacity to love someone else. But I knew it wasn't the right time. Chapter 14. The flowers I planted at the end of summer sprouted in early autumn and produced small buds in the depths of winter. The David's camera captured their entire growth. He had transitioned from being a travel blogger to a gardening blogger and was enjoying it. Habits are powerful things. I had to admit that in just a few months, I had grown accustomed to the David's presence. Before I knew it, it was the new year. On the first day of spring, the roses and Chinese roses in the greenhouses bloomed at the same time. I couldn't tell the difference between the two, so I picked one of each to study closely. The David silently approached, bending down beside me to observe the flowers. We were so close that I could smell the faint scent of soap on him, fresh and pleasant. On a whim, I asked him, "Do you know the difference between a rose and a Chinese rose?" Could he tell the difference between a rose and a Chinese rose? And between me and her? The David, who had spent plenty of time online, surely understood the underlying meaning of my question. He was taken aback for a moment, then slowly smiled. "Chloe, there was never a her. There's only you." He looked up at me, his dark eyes brimming with something deep and tender. In that moment, the sea of flowers around us couldn't compare to the beauty of his eyes. Boom! I heard the sound of my emotional walls crashing down. Chapter 15. It wasn't that I couldn't love. Once I was certain of my feelings, I officially entered a relationship with the David at the end of March. Despite the change in our relationship status, the way we interacted didn't change much. After half a year together, the David remained as gentle and easygoing as he had been when we first met. After March, my flower fields finally opened up to both online and offline sales, and I no longer had any issues with slow sales. When my parents found out I had started growing flowers, they called me. My mother's voice was sharp and grating, and everything she said was meant to belittle me. She accused me of having no ambition, of being destined to rot in the dirt for the rest of my life. I had no idea why my biological parents harbored such malice toward me. In the end, I simply stopped caring about them. Calmly, I said, "If you despise me so much, then from now on, just pretend you never had me." My mother's shrill shouting came to an abrupt halt. My father hurriedly took over the phone and scolded me for being old enough to know better, asking why I was still being so immature. I laughed. "Well, at least you have one daughter who knows better." Having me in their lives was clearly one too many. My father sighed, telling me to calm down before hanging up. I took a deep breath of the flower-scented air, only to see the David walking toward me with a bouquet of baby's breath in his hands. He handed me the flowers and awkwardly scratched his nose, asking if I liked them. Even though I had kept my emotions under control, he had sensed my discomfort. I lowered my head to look at the flowers and suddenly remembered their meaning: silent guardianship, love. I recalled how, whenever I had a conflict with my parents in the past, George would always frown at me and even criticize my bad temper. I leaned in to hug the David. His body stiffened at first, but then his arms tightened around my waist. I could hear his heartbeat, faster and faster. Suddenly, I found myself longing for this warmth. Chapter 16. In the 5th year of our relationship, our daughter turned 3, and she would be starting kindergarten in September. Because of household registration issues, my David had to return to H City for a while. Originally, I wasn't planning on going with him, but when my best friend heard about it, she insisted I visit her, using every trick in the book to convince me. I hadn't seen her in over 2 years, and I did miss her, so I decided to go along with my David. As soon as we arrived in H City, we headed straight to the local police station to handle our daughter's household registration. Since it would take a while, I decided to take our daughter for a walk down the street. Being in an unfamiliar place, my daughter was curious about everything and refused to walk, stretching her arms out for me to carry her. This little one had been spoiled by my David and had become somewhat delicate, often tearing up when things didn't go her way. As I carried her around, we turned a corner, and suddenly, I spotted a familiar figure. My first instinct was to walk away, but in the next moment, George looked up, and his eyes skimmed over me before snapping back in surprise. We locked eyes from across the street. I tightened my hold on my daughter and turned my face away without expression. We were now the most familiar strangers, nothing more. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw George extinguish his half-smoked cigarette and stride toward me. Not wanting to get entangled with him, I turned to leave. George called after me, "Chloe." I frowned but stopped walking. He hurried over, glancing at me before his gaze landed on the child in my arms. After a long pause, he frowned, his tone accusatory. "Your daughter is almost 6 now. Why does she look so small and skinny?" 6 years old? Did George seriously think that after the divorce, I would have given birth to his child on my own? Chapter 17. Sensing danger. My daughter wrapped her thin arms tightly around my neck, burying her little head into my shoulder, softly calling for her daddy. I patted her back soothingly, then looked at George. After 6 years, he hadn't changed much. There was no awkward reunion, no irritation at seeing each other again. Whatever feelings of love or resentment I once had toward him had long since faded with the passing years. George glanced at me before his gaze returned to my daughter. His expression grew complicated. His eyes lowered, difficult to read. Based on his earlier comment, I could guess his thoughts. He must have thought this was the child I'd lost back then. So, he had known about the pregnancy all along and yet had done nothing for 6 years? Typical George. A sudden urge to laugh rose within me. But before I could, a deep sadness welled up. How blind had I been back then? After a brief silence, George took a step forward. "You." His words were interrupted by another voice. "Luna." My daughter perked up instantly at the sound, lifting her head to excitedly call out, "Daddy!" At the sight of my David approaching from the street, the David's gaze briefly passed over George before he strode over to me. He nodded at George, then reached out to take our daughter from my arms. She nestled into his shoulder, occasionally calling out "Daddy" in her sweet little voice, and he gently patted her head, smiling indulgently. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shock and disbelief on George's face. He must have recognized the David. A sense of satisfaction surged within me, and I said lightly, "My daughter just turned 3. The light that had momentarily sparked in George's eyes shattered. "George, it's been 6 years. It's time to wake up from this long dream." Chapter 18. After soothing our daughter for a moment, my David turned to me, holding our daughter in one arm. He extended his other hand to me. "Shall we go?" I nodded, naturally taking his hand. We had only taken a few steps when we encountered another familiar face, Sophia. She had always been George's biggest academic rival in school. I remembered that the two of them never got along. In school, apart from competing in various contests together, they seemed to have little interaction. Even when passing each other, they'd look away in mutual disdain. Sophia was clearly taken aback when she saw me, her lips twitching awkwardly as she avoided my gaze and turned her attention to her right. She was holding the hand of a boy, around 6 or 7 years old. Upon seeing George, the boy let go of her hand and ran toward him, calling out, "Daddy." "Aw, so that's how it is." In that instant, everything became clear to me. I glanced back at George. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but he quickly turned his head away, avoiding my eyes. My David squeezed my hand a little tighter, and I calmly turned away, walking on. As we passed by Sophia, I heard her voice, "Chloe, congratulations." I paused, then let out a cold laugh. "I should thank you for that." Ha! What right did the woman who had once come between my marriage have to feign sincerity in front of me? The people who leave you behind, yesterday's days, are not worth holding on to. Chapter 19. After we returned from H City, life for our little family of 3 returned to its usual peaceful rhythm, filled with sweetness. Half a month later, one day while I was pruning flowers, I looked up to see my David holding our daughter, his face dark as he stared out the window. He had always been gentle, and after so many years together, this was the first time I had seen such an expression on his face. I followed his gaze and noticed a familiar figure standing outside. George was in the courtyard, talking to my grandmother, but his eyes were fixed on the window. No wonder my David looked so upset. But what was George doing here? After calming our daughter, my David gave me a look and left me with, "Don't go out." Before stepping outside, through the window, I watched as he and George exchanged words. The two men, similar in age, exuded completely different energies, each with his own unique charm. I barely spared George a glance, my gaze fixated on my David. Once I looked at him, I couldn't seem to look away. I had never seen him so tense, his whole posture radiating hostility. I watched him for a while longer before realizing that I was smiling unconsciously. When my David walked back inside, my smile was still on my face. He paused, noticing my expression, and his eyes darkened with an unreadable emotion. "You seem very happy." Realizing he had misunderstood, I explained plainly, "I've never seen you so angry at anyone before." His face softened a bit at my words. He picked up our daughter, who was playing with blocks, and, with her between us, pulled me into his embrace. His voice reached my ear. "Go talk to him." After a pause, he added, "Don't do anything foolish." I stood beneath the grapevines in the courtyard, facing George. Even though it had only been half a month since I last saw him, he looked much more haggard. His face was unshaven, and his clothes were wrinkled, something I had never seen from George before. He stared at me without saying anything, and the air around us felt heavy. Grandma, probably uncomfortable with the atmosphere, stood up with her cane and said she wanted to take a walk since the courtyard felt stuffy. Once she left, I broke the silence first. "George, although it's been many years, there's something I've always wanted to ask you." A glimmer of hope flickered in his dull eyes. I guessed he thought I was going to ask him if he had ever loved me. Ha! How shallow. George cleared his throat and, though his voice was hoarse, he said, "Go ahead." I caught a glimpse of the tall figure at the window, his lips quirking up slightly, as I leaned forward and asked in a low voice, "Did the stolen fruit taste sweet?" George froze in place, his expression cracking bit by bit. His lips moved, but no words came out. A wave of satisfaction surged within me. George's grip on the grapevine trellis turned his knuckles white. "I'm sorry," he finally uttered an apology. 6 years too late. I thought, but the rest of his words wouldn't come out. Thought what? Thought that I loved him so deeply that even after the divorce, I would have given birth to his child and raised it alone? But George, no one is born owing anything to anyone. You're over 30 now. How do you still not understand this? I said nothing, my gaze cold as I looked at him. George met my eyes, his bloodshot gaze holding mine, before he left with one final sentence, "Chloe, you probably won't believe this, but I really do regret it. I paused, then slowly smiled. And what of it? No one knows better than I do that George didn't truly regret what he had done. He was just uncomfortable seeing that I was doing better without him. Even happier than when we were together. In other words, even if George did regret it, so what? What right does he have to come to me years later, after all the hurt, and tell me he regrets it? Don't talk to me about better late than never. The one thing I despise most in this life is the so-called reformed scoundrel. Chapter 20. After 6 years apart, George could still delude himself into thinking I'd have had that child, his confidence based on my once unwavering devotion to him. When he finally realized what he had lost, it was inevitable that he wouldn't be able to accept it. In the end, I was more at peace with things than he was, and I had no desire to continue the conversation. My words urged him to leave sooner rather than later. George left my home, but he didn't leave the town. He rented a room at a nearby inn and would stand far off every morning, watching in the direction of our home. Each day, my David's face grew darker, though he tried not to show his emotions in front of me and our daughter. Finally, one night, while I was asleep, he quietly got dressed and slipped out of the house. As soon as he left, I got up and followed him secretly. Sure enough, the David had arranged to meet George. I crouched under a window, eavesdropping on their conversation. After a long silence, it was George who spoke first. Before I came here, Sophia told me everything. When I met her again, I found out that your hand was behind it all. My heart sank, but I quickly regained my composure. Ah, so that's what broke George. The David said nothing. I heard George grit his teeth. Quite the scheme you pulled off. There was more silence. I quietly stood up and peered through a crack in the window to see inside. So what? The David stood in the shadow cast by the fluorescent light. From my angle, I couldn't see his expression, only hear his cold voice. Love is something you have to fight for, isn't it? His voice dripped with sarcasm. I've loved Chloe since I was 18. At 28, I loved her even more. And now, at 32, my love for her only grows. You, on the other hand, you have a restless nature. If it hadn't been Sophia, it would have been someone else. Chloe's life with you was nothing short of torment. The opportunity was right in front of me. Why wouldn't I seize it? And what if Chloe finds out? George's voice wavered with hope. What if Chloe finds out that you interfered with her marriage? Can you guarantee she won't hold it against you? For a brief moment, the David stepped out of the shadows, his expression unreadable. But then, he retreated back into the darkness. Chapter 21. The next day, when I saw George again, I walked straight over to him. Before he could speak, I cut him off. I heard everything you two talked about last night. A spark of hope flickered in George's eyes. He pressed his lips together. Chloe. There was nothing between Sophia and me. Everything was. I interrupted him coldly. Our marriage was never a happy one. You never really cared about me. Your parents and even your sister always thought I married you to climb the social ladder. They never accepted me. 6 years have passed since our divorce. You and I have both moved on. We have our own families now. So why did you come all this way to find me? Do you think? I trailed off, letting out a bitter laugh. George, we were once married. Don't make me lose all respect for you. The last bit of light in George's eyes went out. Fate has run its course. Let's part on good terms. I returned the words George had once said to me. In the distance, I saw my David waving at me, holding our daughter in his arms. I smiled and walked past George toward them. Our daughter stood between us as my David and I exchanged a glance, and we couldn't help but laugh together. Hand in hand, with our daughter between us, we slowly walked toward the flower fields. The sun still shone brightly, and life was as beautiful as ever. The end of a marriage doesn't mean the end of happiness. It can be the beginning of something even better. As long as you hold on to your true self, someone will be willing to make their way through all the fog, just to be with you. Bonus, George. Chapter 1. Blinding sunlight filtered through the window, striking my eyes as I woke from a hangover. My head throbbing painfully. The phone next to my pillow was still ringing incessantly, and the name Sophia flashed repeatedly on the screen. A wave of irritation welled up inside me, and I hurled the phone against the wall. It shattered into pieces. Finally, the world was silent. I rubbed my temples, but Chloe's words still echoed in my ears, every syllable severing any connection between us. They were the same words I had once said. Yet when she threw them back at me, they pierced my heart with brutal clarity. It had been 6 years since the divorce. We both had our own families now. We shouldn't be interfering in each other's lives. But I couldn't control it. When I hadn't seen her, even after I learned that there might have been a child between us, I'd thought about going to find her, but I never acted on it. I knew Chloe loved me. She loved me deeply. More than anyone. Being the one who is loved makes you arrogant. I was the one who cheated. So what? I was still invincible. That was, until I saw her again 6 years later, standing next to David Lee, or maybe I should call him David Sue. No one ever knew about the hidden thoughts I once harbored. No one knew that the first reason I coincidentally appeared in Chloe's life was because I knew David had feelings for her. I didn't understand it. How could someone as proud as David marry a divorced woman? Chapter 2. The year I met David. He was still using the surname Sue, his father's name. David was excellent in every way, kind, polite, and academically gifted. Though only a year older than me, he was the epitome of the golden child in the eyes of many parents, including my own. At first, I saw David simply as the boy next door. I neither liked nor disliked him, unlike other kids who idolized him. That changed one day when my father, seeing me sweaty and exhausted after a day of playing, sighed and said a sentence I've never forgotten: "If only you were as well behaved as David." It was the first time I'd heard my stern, serious father praise anyone, and that person wasn't me. Jealousy started to creep into my heart without me even realizing it. And when my mother praised David's excellent grades and my sister said, "David, you're so much better than my brother," that jealousy spiraled out of control. I started paying attention to David and noticed that his life was simple. He spent his time studying, growing flowers, and taking care of a cat. He liked to sit under the tree in the garden, reading. His upper body was hidden in the shade, while his legs were bathed in sunlight. A chubby orange tabby lay lazily in his lap, dozing with half-closed eyes. Sunlight, flowers, a boy, a chubby cat. Under the shade of a tree, it all looked so perfect. Such a quiet, gentle boy. No wonder the adults adored him. I began to mimic David, toning down my personality and copying his mannerisms, his style of dress. Even I knew I was just a counterfeit. I hated myself for it, yet I couldn't stop. Then, when I was 16 and David was 17, everything changed. One day after school, David saw a little tabby cat stuck in a tree, too scared to come down. Tall and lanky, David seemed worried he'd scare the kitten, so he took off his jacket and held it up, signaling to the cat that it could jump and he'd catch it. The kitten was anxious, meowing nonstop, but it didn't dare to jump. Boy and cat were locked in a standoff. I scoffed, thinking David's compassion was excessive. After about 10 minutes, the kitten finally jumped, and David caught it in his arms. I didn't know that a passerby had captured the scene on camera. Later, when I arrived a bit late, I saw the kitten's owner, a pretty, delicate girl. Chapter 3. Perhaps because David and I looked similar from behind, the girl mistook me for him. She came over to thank me. She was a clear-eyed 16 or 17-year-old girl, her gaze transparent, like you could see right through her. But I had no intention of claiming credit for something I didn't do. I wasn't that low, until one day, I saw that same girl handing David a bottle of water after he finished playing basketball. David stared after her for a while, blinking rapidly before a faint smile appeared on his face. I knew David better than he knew himself. I recognized that look. It was interest, perhaps even the beginnings of love. In all the years I'd known him, it was the first time I'd seen David show interest in a girl. To take someone David liked, that petty, despicable feeling took root in my heart, spreading uncontrollably. Being with Chloe turned out to be easier than I'd expected, and I saw David's disappointed gaze more than once during that time. That only solidified my determination to stay with Chloe. Finally, when David turned 18, an illegitimate child of his father came forward, shaking the foundation of their family. David's mother, a proud and fiery woman, couldn't swallow the insult. Despite her good upbringing, she couldn't bring herself to hurl insults publicly. So instead, she quietly left the family with David. For the first time, I was free from David's shadow. For reasons I still don't fully understand. I didn't break up with Chloe. She had a great personality. Much more interesting than I had imagined. After living for 17 or 18 years, she was the first girl I ever got close to. By then, I could no longer tell if my feelings for her were genuine or simply born out of my earlier determination. It seemed only natural that after graduation, we got married. Chapter 4. At the beginning, I truly thought I'd spend my life with Chloe. What changed later, I don't even want to think about it. In the end, I was the one who wronged her. After the divorce, we were supposed to go our separate ways. So why did I chase her all the way here? Maybe, as Chloe said, even after the divorce, I couldn't bear to see her with someone else, especially when that someone was the one person I had tried so hard to avoid, David. The day before I was set to leave, Sophia showed up with my sister. They couldn't find me, so naturally, they went to Chloe. When I arrived, my sister was hurling insults at Chloe, mocking her with every word. She accused Chloe of being shameless, of interfering in someone else's family after her divorce. Chloe's expression didn't change. She glanced at my sister and Sophia, her voice cold. What? Did the leash on your dogs break? Why are they barking at my door? My sister's face turned livid. But before she could speak, Chloe smiled. She turned to Sophia. What are you hiding in the back for? Who's the real homewrecker here? Don't you know best? Sophia's face paled. Chloe spotted me standing behind them and sighed, as if bickering with them was beneath her. This world runs on karma. Sophia, whether you believe it or not, the pain I went through will come back to you tenfold. With Sophia's back to me, I couldn't see her expression. Chloe waved her hand dismissively. George, take them and leave. I don't ever want to see any of you again. David took her hand, and together, they disappeared into a sea of flowers. I watched their retreating figures, my heart heavy with bitterness. Sophia, her face dark, turned to me, her voice dripping with malice. What's the matter? Still too lost in your dream to wake up? I glanced at her and thought of the times she had deliberately inserted herself into my marriage with Chloe. It was Sophia who had revealed to David the shameful truth about how I had pretended to rescue that cat to win Chloe's favor. A sense of disgust rose within me. Without a word, I turned and walked away. Because of that foolish gamble, I had lost the girl who had walked through my entire youth with me. In the end, I lost to David. Forever. I lost the love of my life.